A racist passenger demands a black woman be removed from a plane, then is shocked to learn she's the co-pilot. Have you ever found yourself in a situation that completely challenges your beliefs and forces you to confront your own biases? A story where everything seems predictable, but in the end, it turns your expectations upside down? Today, I'm bringing you an extraordinary tale, one that starts with a passenger making a shocking demand on a flight, but ends with a lesson he'll never forget. Before we dive into this captivating story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our powerful and thought-provoking stories. The departure lounge buzzed with the usual chaos of a late afternoon flight. Passengers juggled oversized carry-ons, clutched coffee cups, and exchanged hasty goodbyes on their phones. Among them was Alex Porter, a middle-aged man in a tailored blazer whose sharp gaze swept over the crowd with a hint of disdain. He preferred the exclusivity of private charters, but had grudgingly settled for a commercial flight after his client canceled their corporate jet. He huffed as he approached the gate, where the line for priority boarding stretched longer than he anticipated. Alex tugged at his watch and muttered under his breath, "Why is everyone here so common?" His piercing eyes landed on a young woman in uniform entering through the crew door. She walked with quiet confidence, her black leather case swinging at her side. Her skin was the color of rich mahogany, and her thick, coiled hair was neatly pulled back. Alex scowled. "Great," he muttered. "They'll let anyone work these days." As the line inched forward, Alex found himself standing just a few feet from the crew door, which opened as Naomi Bennett stepped through again. This time, she carried a clipboard and was speaking quietly to another crew member. Her uniform bore no visible rank insignia, and Alex's judgmental mind immediately relegated her to a minor role, a cleaner or baggage handler perhaps. "Excuse me," Alex said loudly, interrupting her conversation. Naomi turned to him with a polite smile. "I think one of your staff needs to reassign my seat. I don't sit in the back." He jabbed a finger at his boarding pass. Naomi glanced at the pass briefly but maintained her calm demeanor. "I'm sorry, sir, but seat assignments are handled at the counter. Let me call someone to assist you." Her voice was smooth, her tone professional. To Alex, it sounded like insolence. "Don't brush me off," he snapped. "You people need to start doing your job properly." Naomi's expression didn't waver, but the sharp edge in her gaze hinted at the composure she was mustering. "Sir, if you'll excuse me, I have other duties to attend to. Please speak with the ground crew." She turned back to her colleague, her posture unwavering. Alex fumed as she walked away. "Unbelievable," he muttered, stepping into the boarding lane. Once on board, Alex scanned his surroundings and grimaced at the diverse mix of passengers. To him, the cacophony of languages and laughter from families made the cabin feel cramped and disorderly. He settled into his aisle seat and looked up as Naomi entered the plane, her co-pilot's case now prominently displayed. Alex stiffened. She stopped briefly to exchange a word with the senior flight attendant before disappearing toward the cockpit. "That's not right," Alex whispered to himself. He craned his neck, trying to catch another glimpse of her. His thoughts raced with assumptions and indignation. A woman like her, a black woman, had no business in a place of authority, he thought. Moments later, as passengers were still settling in, Naomi reappeared near the galley, conducting a pre-flight check with the attendant. Alex seized the moment. "Excuse me," he barked, his voice carrying over the subdued chatter. Heads turned as Naomi approached, her expression serene. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked. "Yes, there is. What exactly is your role on this flight?" Alex demanded. Naomi blinked, caught off guard by the hostility in his tone. "I'm part of the flight crew," she replied evenly. "Why do you ask? Part of the crew? You're not serious," Alex said, scoffing. "I don't feel safe with someone like you on board." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop as the weight of Alex's words hung in the air. Nearby passengers stared, some murmuring in disbelief. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her professionalism. "Sir, I assure you, all crew members on this flight are highly trained professionals." "That's not good enough," Alex spat. "I want you off this plane. I'll speak to your supervisor if I have to." At that moment, the senior flight attendant appeared, her face a mask of calm authority. "Sir, is there an issue?" "Yes," Alex said, puffing out his chest. "This woman shouldn't be on this flight. She's making me uncomfortable." The attendant's brow furrowed as she glanced at Naomi. "Sir, Ms. Bennett is our co-pilot for this flight." Alex's mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization hit him like a slap. yet he refused to back down. This is unacceptable. I demand a new co-pilot. Sir, the attendant said firmly, you're welcome to leave the flight if you're uncomfortable. However, we cannot and will not remove any member of our crew. Naomi stepped forward then, her voice steady but with an undeniable edge. I assure you, sir, your safety is my highest priority. But if you feel otherwise, I suggest you speak with airport security. The quiet power in her words silenced Alex momentarily. He sank back into his seat, his face burning as he realized the growing number of passengers watching. Yet his indignation simmered under the surface, his mind already formulating a plan to assert his control. As the cabin door closed and the engines roared to life, Naomi disappeared back into the cockpit, but Alex's discomfort was far from over. This was only the beginning. The plane vibrated gently as the engines hummed to life, signaling the impending takeoff. Alex sat rigid in his seat, his jaw clenched and his fists curled around the armrest. His earlier outburst had drawn more attention than he intended, and now the stares of nearby passengers weighed on him like an oppressive cloud. He glanced around, locking eyes with a middle-aged woman 2 rows up. She quickly turned away, whispering something to her companion. On his left, a younger man with headphones smirked, clearly unimpressed with Alex's behavior. Alex shifted in his seat, the heat of humiliation prickling his neck. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. How can anyone trust her to fly a plane? The flight attendant who had confronted him earlier reappeared, strolling down the aisle with practiced ease. Alex leaned forward, determined to salvage his perceived authority. Excuse me, he called out, his voice sharp but quieter this time. Yes, sir. The attendant stopped, her expression composed but with a hint of caution. I need to speak with the captain, Alex said, immediately. The attendant hesitated, then spoke calmly. I'm afraid the captain is occupied with pre-flight preparations. Can I relay a message? No, you cannot relay a message, Alex snapped. This is a matter of safety. That woman shouldn't be in the cockpit. A murmur spread through the nearby rows as passengers strained to listen. The attendant's lips tightened into a thin line. Sir, she said firmly, Ms. Bennett is our co-pilot, fully certified and highly trained. Your concerns have been noted, but if you continue to disrupt the cabin, we'll have no choice but to involve airport security. The subtle threat made Alex's heart race. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially by people he considered beneath him. But before he could muster a retort, the attendant turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him simmering in his seat. In the cockpit, Naomi adjusted the throttle controls, her hands moving with a precision born of years of rigorous training. Beside her, Captain Richard Lee, a grizzled veteran of the skies with salt and pepper hair, glanced over. Everything okay back there? He asked casually, his tone laced with mild amusement. Naomi allowed herself a brief smile. Just the usual, she said. Passenger with an overinflated sense of entitlement. Ah, Richard said with a chuckle. There's always one, isn't there? Naomi's smile faded as she stared out the cockpit window, the tarmac stretching endlessly before them. Sometimes I wonder if it'll ever change, she admitted quietly. You'd think people would judge us by our skills, not by. She trailed off, the words lingering in the air. Richard's expression softened. You're one of the best co-pilots I've ever worked with, Naomi. Don't let a loudmouth like him make you question that. She nodded, grateful for his support, but a knot of tension remained in her chest. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how many accolades she earned, there were always people like Alex Porter waiting to tear her down. As the plane taxied to the runway, Alex fidgeted in his seat. He could feel the pressure of collective judgment from the other passengers, though no one openly confronted him. His pride battled with his growing unease. The plane began its ascent, the engines roaring as the ground fell away beneath them. Alex tightened his grip on the armrests, a slight sheen of sweat forming on his brow. He hated flying, but admitting fear was out of the question. Instead, he focused his anger, muttering complaints about the seating, the service, and, of course, Naomi. 30 minutes into the flight, turbulence hit. The plane jolted violently, and gasps erupted throughout the cabin. A child a few rows back began to cry, and the overhead bins rattled ominously. Alex's stomach churned as the aircraft dipped suddenly before stabilizing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. We'll do our best to minimize the disturbance. But it wasn't the captain's voice that held the cabin's attention. Moments later, it was Naomi's. Her voice was clear and commanding as she provided additional reassurance, explaining the situation with a confidence that cut through the passenger fear. For Alex, however, her presence over the intercom only fueled his resentment. "She's probably making things worse," he muttered to himself, though the rational part of him knew better. Back in the cockpit, the turbulence had eased, but Naomi and Richard remained focused. Richard glanced at Naomi, impressed by her composure. "You handled that like a pro," he said. "Thanks," Naomi replied, though her mind lingered on the passenger in 14C. She knew people like Alex were more than a nuisance. They represented the very obstacles she'd spent her life overcoming. But she also knew better than to let them rattle her. As the plane leveled out, the cabin relaxed. The child's crying subsided, and passengers returned to their books and conversations. But Alex remained tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this flight, about Naomi, was a personal affront. Then, without warning, the turbulence returned, more severe this time. Oxygen masks deployed with a hiss, and the cabin filled with nervous whispers and gasps. Alex's bravado crumbled as he clutched his seat, his knuckles white. In the cockpit, Naomi's voice was calm but firm as she worked with Richard to navigate the sudden storm front. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands never faltered. "Adjusting to 20,000 feet, she said. "We need to avoid the storm cells to the north." Richard nodded. "You've got this, Naomi." For a moment, as Naomi's hands moved deftly over the controls, she forgot about the passengers, the prejudice, and the weight of proving herself. She was in her element, doing what she did best. Back in the cabin, Alex clung to his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by a gnawing fear. As the plane stabilized once more, a new thought crept into his mind, a grudging realization that the person he'd belittled might have just saved his life. But Alex wasn't ready to face that truth yet. Not just yet. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight reached cruising altitude, the earlier turbulence fading into a distant memory. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the passengers, but the tension in Alex Porter's chest remained. He sat stiffly, his mind whirring with a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and an unspoken sense of vulnerability. For a man accustomed to control, the storm outside mirrored the one brewing within him. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles offering refreshments, Alex flagged one down, his expression still dark. It was the same attendant who had rebuked him earlier, her professional demeanor a shield against his simmering hostility. "I need to lodge a formal complaint," Alex announced, his voice sharp but quieter this time to avoid attracting more attention. "That woman in the cockpit, what's her name?" "Naomi? She shouldn't be flying this plane." The attendant's brows arched slightly, but she remained composed. "Sir, as I mentioned before, Ms. Bennett is one of our most experienced co-pilots. If you'd like to file a complaint, you're welcome to do so after we land." "I'd like to do it now," Alex insisted, his tone edging toward petulant. "This is a matter of safety." The attendant didn't flinch. "Sir, our priority is the safety and comfort of all passengers. If you're feeling unsafe, I can assure you that it's unwarranted. Ms. Bennett is fully qualified." Alex opened his mouth to retort, but stopped short when the plane jolted again, a small shudder that reminded him of their precarious position tens of thousands of feet above the ground. He sank back into his seat, defeated for the moment, as the attendant moved on. In the cockpit, Naomi and Captain Richard Lee worked in seamless coordination, their communication precise and steady. The storm front they had encountered earlier lingered to the east, and Naomi carefully monitored its development on the radar. "Looks like the worst of it's behind us," Richard remarked, adjusting a control. "Nice work back there." Naomi gave a small nod, her eyes scanning the instrument panel. "Thanks. It's all about staying ahead of it." Spoken like a seasoned pro, Richard said with a smile. Then, after a pause, he added, "I heard there was some noise in the cabin earlier." Naomi exhaled softly, her fingers hovering over the throttle controls. "Passenger in 14C. He wasn't thrilled to see me." Richard shook his head, his expression hardening. "It's 2024, for crying out loud. You think we'd be past this?" "You'd think," Naomi replied. "But some people are determined to cling to their ignorance." Richard regarded her thoughtfully. "And yet, you're up here flying this plane with grace and skill, while he's back there sulking in a cramped seat. I'd say you've already won." Naomi allowed herself a small smile at that, but the weight of Alex's words still lingered. She had learned long ago to push through such encounters, but they never failed to leave a mark. Back in the cabin, Alex sat brooding. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, the repetitive motion a futile attempt to calm his growing unease. He hated the sense of powerlessness that came with flying, trapped in a metal tube, his life quite literally in someone else's hands. And now, to know that one of those hands belonged to Naomi, it was almost too much to bear. A voice crackled over the intercom, and Alex's ears perked up. It was her. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot, Naomi Bennett. We've successfully navigated through some earlier turbulence and are now cruising at 32,000 feet. Weather conditions ahead are clear, and we're on track for an on-time arrival. Thank you for your patience and cooperation." Her tone was calm, authoritative, and, much to Alex's chagrin, reassuring. There was no trace of arrogance, no need to prove herself. She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Alex shifted uncomfortably. Her voice didn't match the caricature he had built in his mind. It wasn't the voice of someone unqualified or unworthy. It was the voice of a professional, someone far above the petty disdain he had thrown her way. As the flight attendants collected empty cups and snack wrappers, Alex noticed the young man beside him, a college student judging by the worn textbook in his lap. The man leaned slightly toward Alex, his voice low. "Rough flight, huh?" he said with a grin. Alex grunted in response, unwilling to engage. The young man continued, his tone casual but pointed. "Pretty cool to have a co-pilot like Ms. Bennett, though. I read an article about her a while back. She's one of the youngest women to become a senior co-pilot in her airline. Top of her class in flight school." Alex's brows furrowed. "Is that so?" he said, trying to mask his skepticism. "Yep," the man said, flipping a page in his book. "She's a trailblazer, really. Kind of embarrassing for the rest of us that she has to deal with people questioning her all the time, though. Can't imagine what that's like." Alex stiffened at the veiled jab, but said nothing. His mind churned with conflicting thoughts. The turbulence he felt now wasn't external, it was internal. The young man's words planted a seed of doubt that began to grow, unraveling the certainty of Alex's prejudice. The plane began its gradual descent, the sprawling cityscape below coming into view through the windows. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their approach and preparing the passengers for landing. Alex's pulse quickened. He had spent the entire flight stewing in his own indignation, but now a sense of inevitability loomed. He would soon have to face the truth he had resisted from the moment Naomi walked onto the plane. As the wheels touched down with a smoothness that spoke to the skill of the pilots, Alex couldn't help but feel a grudging respect. The landing was flawless, a testament to the professionalism he had so adamantly dismissed. The passengers applauded, a common ritual for a well-executed landing. Alex, however, remained silent, his hands gripping the armrest. He knew the applause wasn't just for the captain, it was for Naomi too. And though he couldn't admit it yet, a part of him felt it was deserved. The plane's engines hummed softly as it taxied toward the gate, the journey nearing its end. Alex Porter sat motionless, his thoughts turbulent despite the calm atmosphere in the cabin. The applause for the landing had died down, replaced by the rustle of passengers collecting their belongings and the occasional click of overhead bins being opened. Yet Alex remained rooted, the earlier storm within him refusing to subside. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and a flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Welcome to your destination. Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate," and the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. "On behalf of our flight crew, thank you for flying with us." Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his chest tight. He replayed the events of the flight in his mind, each moment compounding the weight of his earlier outburst. He was no stranger to conflict, but this was different. There was no recovering from the humiliation he had inflicted upon himself, no easy way to rationalize his behavior. As the plane came to a stop at the gate, Naomi Bennett and Captain Richard Lee worked in tandem to complete the post-flight checks. Richard leaned back in his seat, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Another flawless landing," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "You keep this up, and they'll be bumping you to captain in no time." Naomi offered a modest smile, but said nothing. Her focus was elsewhere, her mind lingering on the man in 14C. She had felt his eyes on her throughout the flight, his disdain a palpable force. It wasn't the first time she had encountered someone like him, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, It had been particularly draining. Richard seemed to sense her thoughts. "Don't let him get to you," he said gently. "People like that don't matter." Naomi exhaled deeply. "I know," she replied. "But sometimes it's hard to shake off. It's not just about me. It's about what I represent. Every time someone like him questions my place, it feels like they're questioning all of us." Richard nodded solemnly. "And every time you rise above it, you prove them wrong. That's what matters." Naomi's grip on the control panel tightened briefly before she released it. "You're right," she said softly. "Thanks, Captain." The cabin door opened, and the flight attendants began ushering passengers off the plane. Alex waited impatiently, his carry-on tucked at his feet. He had no desire to linger or risk another encounter with Naomi. His plan was simple: disembark quickly, file a complaint with the airline, and put the entire experience behind him. But fate had other plans. As the passengers trickled out, Alex noticed a commotion near the front of the plane. A woman in a crisp business suit had entered the aircraft, her presence commanding immediate attention. She exchanged words with the flight attendants, her gaze scanning the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice firm but polite, "I'm an executive with the airline. I'd like to personally commend our flight crew for their exemplary performance during this flight. If you experienced any turbulence, it's thanks to their skill and professionalism that we arrived safely." The passengers clapped politely, though Alex's hands remained firmly on his lap. His stomach churned as the woman continued. "I'd also like to highlight the contributions of our co-pilot, Naomi Bennett, who has consistently demonstrated exceptional leadership and expertise." At that moment, Naomi emerged from the cockpit, her uniform crisp and her posture confident. The applause grew louder, and Alex felt his cheeks burn. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet hers. As the passengers filed out, Alex found himself trapped in the awkward shuffle of bodies near the aisle. To his horror, he ended up face to face with Naomi as she stood near the cockpit door, thanking passengers as they exited. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her expression, not anger or smugness, but something deeper, perhaps pity. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Thank you for flying with us, sir," she said evenly, her tone professional but with an undeniable edge. Alex swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He wanted to say something, anything, to regain some semblance of control, but no words came. He nodded stiffly and hurried past her, the weight of her gaze following him down the jet bridge. Outside the gate, Alex's irritation flared anew as he searched for the complaints desk. He spotted a counter marked "Customer Relations" and marched toward it, his steps quick and purposeful. "I'd like to file a complaint," he announced to the agent behind the desk, a young man with a warm smile. "Of course, sir," the agent replied. "Can you tell me what the issue was?" Alex hesitated, suddenly aware of how his grievance might sound when spoken aloud. "The co-pilot," he began, "Naomi Bennett. She was unprofessional." The agent blinked, his smile faltering slightly. "Unprofessional, sir? Could you provide some details?" Alex faltered. He couldn't very well complain about her presence without exposing his bias. "She made me uncomfortable," he said vaguely. The agent regarded him for a moment before typing something into his computer. "I see," he said, his tone neutral. "I'll make a note of that. However, I'd like to inform you that Ms. Bennett is one of our most highly regarded pilots. We've received numerous commendations about her professionalism and skill." Alex's face burned. "Just file the complaint," he snapped, turning on his heel before the agent could respond. As Alex stormed out of the terminal, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something intangible, a piece of the authority he had always wielded so effortlessly. Naomi's calm, unyielding presence had shattered the fragile illusion of superiority he clung to, leaving him exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, Alex Porter felt small, and no amount of bluster could change that. The drive home from the airport was a blur. Alex Porter gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. The rhythmic hum of the highway failed to soothe him. If anything, it amplified the noise in his head. The humiliation, the indignation, the gnawing sense of unease, all of it festered, refusing to be silenced. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was flushed, his eyes hard. "Ridiculous," he muttered. "That woman doesn't belong in the cockpit. I don't care how qualified she claims to be." But even as he said the words aloud, they rang hollow. The landing had been flawless, the turbulence expertly managed. Naomi Bennett's calm, commanding voice had been a beacon during the storm, a fact he couldn't deny, no matter how much he wanted to. The truth was a bitter pill, one he wasn't ready to swallow. Not yet. Back at his townhouse, Alex dropped his keys onto the granite countertop and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light. He downed it quickly, the burn in his throat a temporary distraction from the deeper burn of his ego. He paced the living room, his thoughts circling like vultures. The young man on the plane. What had he said? That Naomi was a trailblazer, a top graduate? Alex scoffed at the memory but felt the sting of it all the same. How could someone like her achieve so much? And why did it bother him so deeply? He sank into the leather couch, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He hated flying, but he hated feeling powerless even more. And that's exactly how Naomi had made him feel, powerless. She had stood there, composed and dignified, while he floundered, his anger making him smaller, not stronger. For the first time, Alex allowed himself to consider a possibility that had been lurking at the edges of his mind all day. Maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't Naomi. Maybe the problem was him. The following morning, Alex woke with a dull ache behind his eyes, a hangover not just from the whiskey, but from the emotional toll of the previous day. He shuffled to the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee doing little to lift his mood. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he picked it up reluctantly. It was an email from the airline. Subject: feedback regarding your recent flight experience. Alex's stomach twisted as he opened the message. It began with the usual corporate pleasantries before addressing his complaint directly. We take all passenger feedback seriously and have reviewed the concerns you raised regarding our co-pilot, Ms. Naomi Bennett. After a thorough review, we find no evidence of unprofessional conduct on her part. In fact, Ms. Bennett has consistently demonstrated exemplary performance in her role, as corroborated by her colleagues and numerous passenger commendations. The email went on, but Alex stopped reading. His jaw tightened, his pride wounded yet again. He tossed the phone onto the counter and poured another cup of coffee, trying to ignore the knot in his chest. Later that day, Alex found himself drawn to his laptop. Curiosity gnawed at him, and despite his reluctance, he typed Naomi Bennett's name into the search bar. Articles, interviews, and accolades filled the screen. She was indeed a trailblazer, a woman who had risen through the ranks in an industry that had long been dominated by men, and even more so by white men. He clicked on an article titled, Breaking Barriers at 30,000 Feet, the story of Naomi Bennett. It detailed her journey from a small-town girl with a dream to one of the most respected co-pilots in the airline. Alex leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The article painted a picture of resilience and determination, qualities he had always admired in himself but had failed to recognize in her. Over the next few days, Alex found it harder to justify his behavior on the flight. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his anger had little to do with Naomi's qualifications and everything to do with his own insecurities. He had lashed out because she challenged the image he had of himself, an image rooted in control and superiority. For the first time in years, Alex felt something unfamiliar: shame. It wasn't the kind of shame that could be brushed off or buried under excuses. It was the kind that demanded introspection, the kind that gnawed at him until he faced it head-on. A week later, Alex stood in front of a mailbox, a letter in his hand. He had written it after days of reflection, struggling to find the right words. It wasn't exactly an apology. He wasn't quite ready for that. But it was a step. The letter was addressed to Naomi Bennett, care of the airline. Ms. Bennett, during a recent flight, I behaved in a manner that was disrespectful and unfair. I let my own biases cloud my judgment and failed to acknowledge your professionalism and expertise. While I cannot undo my actions, I want to acknowledge that I was wrong. You deserved better, and I hope to do better moving forward. He hesitated, the weight of the envelope heavy in his hand. Then, with a deep breath, he dropped it into the slot. As he walked away, Alex felt lighter, though the road ahead remained uncertain. For the first time, he allowed himself to see the world not through the lens of his own superiority, but through the eyes of someone who still had much to learn. And though it was a small step, it was a step in the right direction. 2 months passed, but the events of that fateful flight remained fresh in Alex Porter's mind. Life had returned to its usual routine: client meetings, business deals, and polished appearances. Yet a subtle shift had taken root within him, an undercurrent of discomfort that no amount of success could drown out. The letter he had sent to Naomi Bennett marked the beginning of a journey he hadn't anticipated, a journey inward. He had no idea if she had received it, let alone read it. Still, the act of writing it had forced him to confront truths about himself that he had long ignored. One crisp morning, Alex sat in the terminal of a different airport, waiting for his flight to Denver. He sipped a lukewarm coffee, his eyes scanning the bustling crowd. His perspective had changed since his last flight. He noticed the diversity in the terminal, the varied accents, the colorful clothes, the spectrum of skin tones, and found himself wondering about their stories. When boarding was announced, Alex took his place in line. The process was smooth, the staff courteous, and before long, he was seated comfortably in first class. He pulled out a book he'd been meaning to read, a biography of a renowned entrepreneur. The pages, however, failed to hold his attention. His thoughts drifted back to the cockpit door, wondering about the crew. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a familiar voice came over the intercom. "This is your co-pilot, Naomi Bennett. Welcome aboard. We'll be departing shortly, and the flight is expected to be smooth with clear skies ahead. Thank you for choosing to fly with us." Alex froze, the book slipping from his hands. His heart raced as he registered her name. It couldn't be a coincidence. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The flight began without incident. The engines roared to life, and Alex gripped the armrests as the plane ascended smoothly into the sky. Naomi's voice came over the intercom again, providing updates with the same authority he remembered. But this time, he listened with a different ear, not with disdain, but with admiration. Midway through the flight, the seatbelt sign turned off, and the cabin settled into a quiet hum of activity. Alex's thoughts churned. He felt an urge to say something, but the question was, how? Would she even recognize him? Did she care? A flight attendant passed by, and Alex gestured for her attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Is it possible to speak with the co-pilot after we land?" The attendant blinked, surprised by the unusual request. "I can pass along the message," she said. "Is there a specific reason?" Alex hesitated, his pride and vulnerability waging a silent battle. Finally, he said, "I just want to thank her for the flight." The attendant smiled politely. "I'll let her know." As the plane descended into Denver, Alex felt a knot of tension in his chest. What if she refused to see him? What if she remembered him and dismissed his attempt at redemption? He wasn't sure why it mattered so much, but it did. After a smooth landing, the passengers began to disembark. Alex lingered in his seat, letting the others go ahead. When the cabin was nearly empty, the flight attendant returned. "Ms. Bennett said she'd be happy to speak with you briefly," she said with a smile. "You can wait by the cockpit door." Alex's pulse quickened as he stood and walked forward. The cockpit door was open, and Naomi Bennett stepped out, her uniform immaculate, her expression neutral. "Yes?" she said, her voice even but not unkind. Alex cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, I wanted to thank you for the flight. It was excellent. Smooth landing, clear communication, everything." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her posture relaxed but guarded. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the feedback." There was a pause, and Alex shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure if you remember me," he began hesitantly. "A couple of months ago, I was on a flight you co-piloted." He faltered, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "I behaved poorly." Recognition flickered in Naomi's eyes, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I sent a letter afterward," Alex said. "I don't know if you received it, but I wanted to acknowledge my behavior again. It was wrong of me to question your capabilities or your place on that flight. You handled the situation with more grace than I deserved." Naomi studied him for a moment, her expression inscrutable. Finally, she spoke. "I did receive your letter," she said, "and I appreciated it, but actions speak louder than words." Alex nodded, the truth of her statement hitting him squarely. "You're right," he said. "I've been working on that. It's not easy to unlearn things, but I'm trying." Naomi's gaze softened slightly, and she inclined her head. "That's good to hear, Mr. Porter. We all have room to grow." Alex felt a wave of relief, though he knew this was only the beginning of his journey. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "Not just for today, but for your patience. It's something I won't forget." Naomi extended a hand. "Safe travels," she said simply. Alex shook her hand, the gesture small but significant. As he exited the plane, he felt lighter than he had in months. The skies above were clear, but the real change was within him. For the first time, Alex Porter was ready to face the world with a perspective unclouded by prejudice. And that, he realized, was the real redemption. The Denver skyline shimmered in the crisp morning light as Alex Porter stepped into the bustling terminal. The encounter with Naomi Bennett still echoed in his mind, a steady pulse beneath the noise of the airport. It had been brief, yet profoundly unsettling. Her composure, her ability to hold him accountable without bitterness, these qualities haunted him, not as a reprimand, but as a mirror reflecting his shortcomings. For Alex, the handshake had felt like both a closure and a challenge. He had taken a step toward change, but he knew it wasn't enough to write a letter or utter an apology. Change required action, consistency, and humility, traits he had rarely exercised outside the confines of his career. In the weeks following the flight, Alex found himself drawn to the very things he once dismissed. Articles about workplace diversity, stories of underrepresented leaders, and conversations about systemic bias became subjects he actively sought out. His initial resistance softened as he delved deeper, realizing how much he didn't know and how much he had taken for granted. One evening, while scrolling through his news feed, an article caught his eye, Breaking the Glass Ceiling: How Leaders Like Naomi Bennett Are Redefining Aviation. It featured a photo of Naomi standing confidently in front of a jet, her uniform crisp and her gaze steady. The article detailed her journey, the struggles she faced as a young black woman entering an industry dominated by men, the constant need to prove herself, and the barriers she broke to pave the way for others. Alex read every word, his admiration for her growing with each paragraph. One section struck him particularly hard. When asked how she handled prejudice and bias, Bennett said, "It's not easy, but I try to focus on the bigger picture. My success isn't just for me. It's for everyone who looks like me and dreams of reaching the same heights. If I let every negative comment or assumption derail me, I'd never get to where I'm going." Her words lingered in Alex's mind long after he closed the article. She had faced challenges he could scarcely imagine, yet she had risen above them with grace and determination. The thought humbled him. A few weeks later, Alex attended a networking event for executives in the transportation and logistics industry. The keynote speaker was a CEO he admired, known for championing innovation and diversity in aviation. The room was packed with professionals eager to hear his insights. To Alex's surprise, the CEO began his speech with a story about Naomi Bennett. "Many of you know her as one of our most talented co-pilots," the CEO said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But what you may not know is how much she's done to inspire change within our organization. Her leadership goes beyond the cockpit. She's mentored young pilots, advocated for fair hiring practices, and even challenged us to rethink how we define excellence." The audience erupted into applause, and Alex found himself clapping along, a knot forming in his throat. The CEO's words reinforced what Alex had come to realize. Naomi wasn't just an exceptional pilot. She was a catalyst for transformation. That evening, Alex returned home with a newfound sense of purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he could influence the future. He began drafting an initiative for his company, a mentorship program aimed at supporting underrepresented employees in leadership roles. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a commitment to creating the kind of environment where people like Naomi could thrive without constantly proving their worth. The program launched 6 months later with overwhelming support from his team. Alex personally oversaw its implementation, ensuring that it wasn't just a box to check, but a meaningful effort to foster growth and inclusion. The first cohort included a diverse group of employees, each paired with a mentor to guide them through the challenges of their careers. One afternoon, as Alex reviewed reports on the program's progress, his assistant entered with a package. "This just arrived for you," she said, placing it on his desk. Alex opened it to find a framed photo of Naomi Bennett, her signature scrolled across the bottom. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "Mr. Porter, thank you for your letter and for choosing to make a difference. Change isn't easy, but it starts with a single step. I wish you success in your efforts, and I hope our paths cross again. Best regards, Naomi Bennett." Alex stared at the note, a lump rising in his throat. He placed the frame on his desk, where it would serve as a constant reminder of the journey he had undertaken and the responsibility he now carried. Years later, when Alex reflected on his life, he would mark that flight as a turning point. It wasn't the turbulence or the smooth landing that stayed with him. It was the quiet strength of a woman who had dared to challenge his assumptions and, in doing so, had inspired him to change. For Naomi, It had been another day on the job. For Alex, it had been the beginning of something much greater, a legacy of growth, humility, and the understanding that true leadership begins with listening. And so, this story reminds us of the power of humility, growth, and seeing people for who they truly are, not the assumptions we place upon them. It's a powerful lesson in how one moment, one encounter, can change the course of a person's life. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently, don't forget to like, share, and, most importantly, subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge perspectives and ignite change. And remember to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.